Okay, and we're live. Welcome, everybody. This is a Charm School on Vagrant workflow. Uh, I'm joined by Matt Bruzek and Charles Butler, who will actually be doing the Charm School itself. Um, so, Chuck, before we get started, what is Vagrant? Why do I want to do this? We're talking mostly that this is really useful for OS 10 and Windows users. You kind of give us a quick TLDR on why I would want to use Vagrant and things of that nature.
Okay. Well, Juju is awesome, and we have a great developer story for Ubuntu with the local provider. The downside to that is that it is pretty much Linux specific. So if you're an OS 10 developer and you want to get started with using Juju and testing out the concepts, and if you've heard about this, service-oriented architecture and orchestration thing, so how do I get into that? Vagrant is a wrapper around VirtualBox that allows you to deploy a prepackaged virtual machine and run it inside of a virtual environment, so that way you get all of the benefits of us users that use Ubuntu as our desktop and a nice isolated container in your workspace, so that you can iterate quickly using the local provider inside of this virtual machine. And when you're ready for production use, you've got all this testing in, and you can just push straight to your cloud provider using the Juju tool on your native desktop. So what we're really doing is we're kind of packaging up the developer tool and workflow and giving it to everybody, since we've already got a defined pattern here within the Ubuntu ecosystem.
Okay, and for this, you're going to be doing this on your Mac, but this should apply to Windows users as well, right?
Right.
Or even Ubuntu users. I'm gonna follow along. I really want to learn Vagrant. So even though I have LXC native on my laptop, I'm still gonna do LXC inside the virtual, so I can see what that workflow is like. So with that, why don't you get started, and then I'm gonna switch you here to your dedicated screen here, and then I'm just gonna follow along on my Ubuntu machine. Ready?
All right.
Okay,
So there's a couple things to think about. Now, if you're running Ubuntu, you can sudo apt-get install Vagrant and VirtualBox and all of those great dependencies. And all of those are listed on juju.ubuntu.com/docs. And on the left-hand side, there is a Vagrant link in the table of contents that will give you all the package and pre-dependencies that you need. So for those of you that are following along that are not on a native Ubuntu machine, and you need to fetch these, there's a couple different dependencies that you're going to have to get and install. The first of which is going to be VirtualBox, and you can get that from virtualbox.org. And the next one after that is making sure that you've got a Ruby installation, because Vagrant is written in Ruby, and you can fetch the Vagrant dependencies from vagrantup.org. I think is it .org or is it .com? It's .com. So if you head over to vagrantup.com, click on the download link, and then just pick your proper platform, and it'll fetch and install what it needs to get Vagrant up and running. So with that being said, I'm going to switch back over to my terminal, and we're going to get ready to get started. The first bit that you're going to need to know is, A, do you have Vagrant installed? So I'm going to touch Vagrant TechV, and I've got a 1.5 series. Now what's important to note is that if you have Vagrant less than version 1.2, the syntax of the Vagrant file has changed. So if you get a script from a friend and they have done the Vagrant init, and it's got this interesting bit, and I'm just calling this out so that way you're aware, because this is something that bit me as a new user. There's a Vagrant file API version that's listed at the very top, and this calls out 2. The entire syntax of the Vagrant file has changed between API versions 1 and 2, so if you notice that you have an issue, the easiest way to get started with that is going to be just to redo Vagrant init, which we're going to do right now. So let's go ahead and take a look at what it's going to take to get started using Vagrant. Looking at the Juju documentation, there is a note here about boxes, and you may be thinking to yourself, okay, what is a Vagrant box? A Vagrant box is essentially a containerized copy of a virtual machine image. Any of the hypervisors that you use give you an option to export your virtual machine image. That's, in a nutshell, basically what a Vagrant box is. So looking at this, it calls out a Vagrant box add command, and we're going to call it Juju box for the sake of keeping everything nice and namespaced. And we're going to copy and paste this line right here, right into our console. And so once you start doing this, Vagrant's going to reach out over the internet. It's going to say, okay, Cloud Archive, I want this particular image. Go ahead and put it in your cache. And since I've already done that, if I punch in Vagrant Box List, I'm going to see that I have these. This is a list of all the virtual machines that I have available to Vagrant that I can call out by name. And that's how they're listed. You have the name on the left, and you're going to see a little bit here for the hypervisor that it's attached to, and you're going to see the revision number that is associated with it. So now that we've got our Vagrant box imported, we're ready to get started with actually getting it booted and see what the system provisioning looks like. So my first recommendation to you as a charm author is to put this in the root of your charms directory. So if you see, I'm currently in my home directory. I'm going to cd into charms, and let me just remove this from my previous experiments. And I'm going to type vagrant init jujubox. And what this command is going to do is it's going to create a templated Vagrant file for you. So if I edit this and I take a look, I see that it specifies the config box. Now, this is another important part. If you want to share your Vagrant file with another user, if you punch in that same cloud repository URL right here in the config vmbox URL, when your friend pulls down this Vagrant file and issues Vagrant up, it will automatically fetch that box and import it for them with the name that you give up here for jujubox. Now, the rest of this goes into how to configure your virtual machine environment. You can tweak settings such as how many CPUs you allocate to the machine, how much memory is available to the base virtual machine. But for the purposes of getting started quickly, we're going to skip that for now, and we're just going to run Vagrant up. And you're going to notice that once that happens, Vagrant kicks off and starts doing all kinds of fun stuff. It's importing this base box, and it gave it a name of default. And then it's going to run into the actual provisioning, and you're going to see some scrolled output about bootstrapping Juju. So the concept behind this is that there is a boot script that sets up and installs Juju, fetches the GUI, sets up a redirect for you so that way you can access the GUI on your local machine, and gets everything ready for you. So with that in mind, this will take a couple minutes to complete. It generally takes anywhere between 1.5 to 3 minutes to start, and then we can progress forward into looking at what the Vagrant environment offers to us as a user on OS X. So if anybody has, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have some questions here. So typically, do you have one box, or do you do something like have one base box for a different environment, right? So let's say I wanted to.
Well, when you say different environment, can you scope that for me? Because that could mean several.
So let's say I'm a developer and I'm working on 2 applications. Do I have a separate box in that list for application 1, application 2, or?
That's really the developer's preference. I tend to keep just one box, and I share it amongst all of my different projects. Now, the big idea behind that, why I asked you to put it in the charms directory first, is because you're going to get a shared directory map inside of this Vagrant environment. So what that means is that I'm going to edit on my charm on my host machine. I'm going to pull it up in my favorite editor, whether that's TextMate or Sublime or even Vim, and I'm going to hack away on my charm. And I want that to be shared amongst the Juju environment because Juju orchestrates multiple different machines, right?
Okay.
So as I'm working on this project, and I know that, hey, I have to have my SQL as a dependency, and I want to work on this new feature that's not in the charm. So anything that I work on my host machine is mapped into that environment, and then I can deploy both machines in the same virtual machine.
Okay.
Now, what becomes an interesting limitation there is that by default, we have 524 megabytes of system memory to work with off of a base machine. So that's whenever you want to get into tweaking and tuning your virtual machine environment. And if you go to vagrantup.com and look at their documentation, it really is, I believe it's a one-liner.
Okay.
Let's see here, documentation, and there's a Vagrant file right here.
Vagrant file is very well documented. I found it pretty easy.
Yeah, it might even be in the canned response notes in the Vagrant file itself.
Yeah.
So as we were stating that you're going to see a lot of different things happen, our machine has booted at this point, and now we're going through the cloud init scripts, which are setting up our Juju environment, and you'll see that it's starting to do this Juju setup.log, and now it's mentioning Juju GUI. Hey, we get that for free out of the box. That's excellent.
Mm-hmm.
So while we're still waiting for this, are there any other questions?
Let me see if there's any in IRC, if anybody has any questions. Seems like it's working. It's working for me over here. I'm just replicating what you're doing here.
It's really a straightforward process. The big investment is upfront, waiting for it to boot, because once your environment's booted, you have pretty much a native experience whenever you start spinning up machines and getting things moving. So.
Okay.
Now would also be a good time to note that I started aggregating the results of some of the different projects that I've come up with working with Vagrant and Juju. And I started a repository at github.com/mynamespace/Chuck/Butler/Juju /Vagrant Charm School.
I'll go ahead and paste that in the IRC channel.
And you're going to see a couple different directories here, one of which for vanilla, which is everything that we're going through right now to get started. It just gives you the baseline Vagrant image that you can boot up, and it'll automatically import the box for you whenever you run Vagrant up with that Vagrant file in your current working directory. The other is a testing project, and I noticed that using the Juju box that it goes through the booting of a Juju environment and strapping the GUI. So you may have heard about this concept called amulet testing, and wanting to test your machines or your charm in an isolated environment. And sitting through that initial bootstrap process was kind of a drag, because every time you run the provision command, it's going to go through those steps again. Now what this does is it takes a baseline trusty image and it installs Juju for you and gets everything set up so that on subsequent provision commands it just runs through the testing bit. So you can iterate on your tests quickly. And it does that through a supporting shell command, and I'm not stating that this is going to work on everybody's machine. This is very much something that I just kind of came up with as a concept and scratched my own itch.
Sure.
So looking for that, it looks like we're still provisioning.
So Tim has a question. Does it take this long to boot the VM every single time you do Vagrant up, or?
It can. That's strictly dependent on your system memory, whether you're running on an SSD. There's a lot of environment factors in this, and it's going to take, give or take, about 3 to 5 minutes in order for this Vagrant machine to boot up. I've seen it go as quick as 1.5 minutes. I've seen it take as long as 8 minutes.
Yeah, I've already passed you, I think, on my system. So, but once you get it up and running, you can iterate. Like, how often are you doing Vagrant up? Is this something you do every time you boot, or does this?
By having it placed in my charm directory, that happens the first time that I come to my machine. Say, for example, I get really crazy with my images and I tank things. I may have to rerun, a Vagrant destroy and then bring it back up.
Right.
But it's typically just a do a once-a-day thing. Once you have it up and running, you're good to go from there. At that point, you can start iterating and interact with your environment at native speed.
Okay.
So, okay, looks like my machine just came up. And you're going to see some output here that's going to be important to have. It's giving you a password right here, which is the password to your Juju GUI instance. And that's run on localhost port 6080, which is displayed on the line above it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and pull that up. Port 6080. And, oh. That's a new addition that I didn't know. It actually places your password right here on the GUI login screen.
Oh, that's very handy.
And apparently I can't copy and paste. All right, so with this being brought up, we see that we now have an active Juju environment. It's given me the Juju GUI. What am I going to do as a charm author? So let's go through that process. Let's kind of inspect our Vagrant environment. If you punch in Vagrant SSH, this is going to put you into a console directly inside of your virtual machine. You don't need to set up SSH keys or anything crazy like that, because that's been provided for you. So once you're in here, if we punch in Juju status, we see that our local environment is up. We currently have 2 LXC containers. We have our Bootstrap node and we have our GUI deployed. And from here, if we cd to /Vagrant and we issue a list, you'll see that we have Precise and Trusty, which, if you notice, was the same directory tree that we had getting started. So cd into Precise, we see that, hey, those charms that I was working on are listed right here. So this is the bind mount directory that I was talking about, where as you work on things with your host environment, they're available to you immediately within your Vagrant environment. So let's do something persnickety. Let me make sure that I have charm tools installed. I believe I do. Brilliant. So if I cd into my Precise directory and I do charm get MediaWiki, we're going to fetch the MediaWiki charm, and then we're going to drop back into that box here in the vanilla workspace, cd/vagrant, cd precise, and we see that MediaWiki shows up right there. So that's validation of our statement. And if we want to deploy our local charm that we're working on, we do juju deploy, specify our repository equals /vagrant, local precise MediaWiki. Did I mistype something? No. This is troublesome. One moment.
A slash after there?
I don't think we need that, but let's try that. Okay, well, there is a workaround for this. So let's do juju deploy repository equals relative local precise MediaWiki. You know what? I mistyped MediaWiki.
Yeah, that's why you did it.
Awesome. So let's do this. Let's do juju deploy repository equals /vagrant. Let's do local precise /MongoDB. Let's go ahead and. All right, cool. All right, so whenever we switch back over to our GUI, we're going to see that both of these have been added to our deployment map. And they're going to be pending. So this will take anywhere from a couple minutes, depending on how much virtual memory you've given to the machine. And these are going to start spinning up and going through their setup provisions in the LXC and all that other fun stuff. So let's do juju destroy service MongoDB. And we're also not limited to just deploying the local charms in the setup either. We can also do juju deploy MySQL, and it will also, just like if you were running natively on Ubuntu, pull directly from the charm store. So don't feel like you're limited to only having a local charm repository working in this. You get all the amenities that you would have working on an Ubuntu machine given to you by default. So the next use case that I have for this is, let's talk about creating a charm and how we're going to actually interface with this during the charm development workflow. So we're going to create a dummy charm. We're not going to add any hooks because that's been covered before in other charm schools. And where am I at? Okay, this is my parent machine. So I'm going to go into my precise directory, which I'm listed here, and I'm going to do charm create because I've installed charm tools, and this command is provided by charm tools. And we're going to say charm school. So I'm going to cd into this, edit the metadata. Everything looks good. We want to provide fun is going to be the interface name, and it provides happy because it's happy fun. All right, so we've iterated on our charm. We have all of this awesome stuff. We now have a new interface that we want to test out. How am I going to deploy this inside of my Juju environment running in Vagrant? So while it's not as easy as just executing a command from your parent machine, what we do then is we do Vagrant SSH, which I believe I'm already in here. No, I'm not, which is good. Okay. And from here, just like we did before when we showed with branching the local charm, we would do juju deploy, specify a repository, and we do local precise. Now it's important to specify the series, charm school, and we're going to see that pop up in our deployment map shortly. And here's our charm school charm waiting for us. So the basics of charm development workflow is that now instead of having everything available to you within your host environment, you have all of your editing amenities available to you, where if you prefer to use a specific text editor, you have that, and you can still share everything. And the big difference is that now you're going into a virtualized environment to get access to LXC, because unfortunately OS X doesn't have a concept of LXC. So the other use case for this that I've found, which I feel that if there's no questions about the typical developer workflow, is let's go ahead and talk about charm testing and how we're going to get started with that and why this is important to use Vagrant for that story. When it came to writing amulet tests, I found myself often depending on things being available to me in the environment, such as on my development workstation, I always install Python 3, and I always have a few Python development libraries available to me. Like, I'm a big Mongo fan, so I'll have Python, TAC, Mongo available to me. But that's not always the case if I were to distribute my test to someone like, say, Matt, and say, hey, Matt, can you run this for me? He'd be like, dude, I can't get this to run because it says it's missing dependencies. You know, I don't know what's going on. So it's important for you to understand as a developer to run your tests in isolation so that way you get an understanding that from square one, everything is being installed. And this is important specifically within the context of like continuous integration servers where you're getting a fresh environment from step one. And I myself hate to be the guy that broke the build, so giving myself an opportunity to test this on a local, in the local context before I commit this to my repository gives me the faith and feeling that what I'm pushing upstream for other people to look at is of good quality, because I've already considered, you know, well, hey, maybe they don't have this dependency installed, and the tests are running in this isolated environment and they're passing, so if you're seeing something different, let's evaluate what's going on in your environment. And it gives me a nice, clean way to validate those assertions. So in order for me to get a little bit more resources back on my air, I am going to destroy this environment, and I'm going to start with going through that story. So let's do Vagrant, destroy, TAC. Actually, if you don't use the destroy flag, it prompts you, so that we don't accidentally destroy your machine, which is awesome. And I'm going to CD over to my testing. And this is what you'll find in the testing directory of the Vagrant repository that I listed earlier in the Charm School. So within the context of my Charm directory, and this is not necessarily the best way to do it, it's just the quickest way that I found to get iterating quickly on running tests. And I'm going to look at the Vagrant file first, and you'll see that it's very bare bones. It defines two things. It defines the name of my box, which I set to Trusty64, and it defines the box URL, of where it's going to fetch this baseline Ubuntu server image to import into my Vagrant system. And then at the very bottom here, you have this little bit of Vagrant VM provision shell. So what this is telling Vagrant is that, hey, once you've received the bootstrap signal and everything is done setting up, you know, you've got all your ports forwarded and everything that you need to go, execute this script. And it's going to create a copy of this script and put it inside the virtual machine and kick that off. So once I edit the Vagrant test runner, now, what this does is that this is taking care of most of what the Juju box gives you out of by default, is that it's going to set up Juju, install the local provider, it's going to generate an SSH key because the Vagrant user doesn't come with one by default, and after that it's going to go through and switch to the local environment, and then it's going to check your tests directory. And everything that you have located in 00-TAC setup is what's going to be installed on the parent system. So this is going to take care of validating that your dependencies are all getting installed. So if you're assuming that you're going to have a Python MongoDB adapter and you didn't implicitly install it, it's going to fail. And this is where it got value add for me. Directly after that, it's going to check for any file that's in that directory that has executable permissions, and it's going to kick it off. So within the context of the MongoDB charm, since today seems to be about a lot of MongoDB references, let's go ahead and kick this off. So we're going to do Vagrant up, and this is going to boot quite a bit quicker than the Juju image because not as much is happening up front. And we're going to land right into that provisioning script really quickly, and the value add here is that once you're done, you have an option to run Vagrant provision to kick off your test really quickly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to run this and I'm going to interrupt it because these tests take about 14 to 15 minutes to complete, and I'm going to rerun Vagrant provision to show the difference in execution speed after the first boot. So it's also important to note that this, once again, is just a side project. This is not something that we necessarily recommend, but given enough speed, I think that we could get some, or enough traction with the community, I think that we could probably roll this into something that's of great use to everybody out there. And right now I'm just kind of pioneering some concepts and ideas. So any community feedback, if you want to put that into either the issue log or reach out to me on IRC, my name is in the lower corner of Lazy Power, feel free to reach out. I'd love to talk about this and get the conversation started. All right, so the box is already booted, and now it's starting to go through that provisioning shell script of where we're importing Juju local, and we're starting to do some of those different bits. And what you see now is all the apt output. And what's really interesting is that there's going to be two colors that display to you here. Like whenever I first got started with this, I started seeing red scrolling text, and I was like, well, wait a minute. Well, what's going on? Red means bad, right? The way that Vagrant colorizes log output is that whatever comes from the parent shell is going to be in green, and anything that comes from a sub-process of that shell in another thread comes out in red. So don't panic. This is completely normal, and you're going to see it shortly. It's generated the SSH key. Now we're piping into actually running the 00 setup. Installing those dependencies, and we should see it kick off a charm test here in about, I'm going to say 45 seconds, if not sooner. Do. And now it's kicking off tests, and we have red output. So this is normally when I'd be like, okay, what's going on? And at this point, it's safe to assume that you understand that it's going through, it's kicking off what's in the test directory. And I'm going to interrupt this. Okay, so now if I rerun Vagrant Provision, it's not going to go through taking the box down and bringing it back up and us waiting through Juju to be installed again. What it's going to do now is it's just going to kick off that shell script, and that shell script is going to be executed immediately. So this is the value add for you as a test developer is you know, you're working on something and then you tweak a few settings and you want to go back in and rerun it. This is a way to get it done quickly. Since we've already installed Juju, it's gonna run through that a little bit. It's making sure that the repository is added, and you're gonna see it skip a lot of the installation mechanism.
You have a quick question while that's going. Systrom asks, would I be able to manage it from a remote Windows client if I spin it up on another Windows host? So,
I'm not sure what he means by remote Windows client. If you're talking about using remote desktop to interface with this, you certainly could.
right.
I'm actually using Vagrant to test a few of my theories as I commit to my local repository. And in a git commit hook, it actually kicks off the tests. And if the test fails, if the return output is greater than 0, it kicks it out. So as far as interfacing with it remotely, this can be completely scripted. So you as an admin, if you have certain things that you want to interface with and maybe you don't necessarily have physical access to the machine, you certainly can. It, like any other command line utility, supports being interacted with via script, or if you're on a remote machine, as long as you can get to it via remote desktop, you can get things set up as well. And I hope that answers the question. I'm not real sure what you were asking me.
Yeah, it looks like the new versions of Vagrant 1.5 and newer also have Vagrant Share that will let you share your environment and connect.
You know, if that's the case, I don't have the correct answer for you using the Vagrant Share information.
Yeah, I found the docs. I'll put those in IRC here, so we have them. I don't see any reason why that wouldn't work on a local network. But you could set proxies and all sorts of stuff, so it looks pretty slick.
That's pretty cool. See, this is one of the great reasons why I want to start the conversation, because there are so many different use cases for Vagrant out there, because it's already an established developer tool.
Right. That's cool.
I'm trying to think of anything that I might have missed in just Vagrant itself. It's fairly straightforward. The process of making sure that you've got the box added, and then you just Vagrant init so that you're getting a fresh Vagrant file tied to that box, and then Vagrant up. Everything from thereafter is just like a typical workflow. Anything that you want to do with your development, you do on the parent machine. Anything that you need to execute against Juju, you go switch into the context of that Vagrant virtual machine and then kick off your commands. So there's a little bit of a switch in the pathing, but outside of that, everything is straightforward and just as you would find it in the Juju docs.
He's also asking, do I have the ability to bridge the network on the VirtualBox? Yes.
You sure do. Let me cover that. That's a great use case. So whenever it comes to actually connecting to a service that you have deployed within your Vagrant virtual machine, which, did I stop? I'm still waiting for these to spin up. Okay. within the context of making a poor man's VPN into that virtual machine, there's a utility called sshuttle. And we touched that briefly in the Juju document. So scrolling down through here, there is a command, and it's you need to make sure that you have sshuttle installed on your machine. Now, this is verified to only work on POSIX-based systems. It does not work for the Windows counterpart. And whenever you run sshuttle and you tack E and you specify this command that would actually bring you into the Vagrant machine, is that this is creating a tunnel into that environment. So whenever you forward the 10.0.3.x traffic in there, it's going to proxy all of your connections into the context of that Vagrant machine, and you can then reach those LXC containers. So what you're doing is that you're remoting into the virtual machine first, and then that's responsible for forwarding the communication on.
Yeah, and for VirtualBox itself, in the Vagrant file, it's commented on where you do the network and bridging, right?
Right.
That way you could have the LXC containers in the virtual machines serving services to like your local network, right? Then you have a nice portable thing going on there.
You have your own little portable personal cloud. So
right.
that
your own MediaWiki that you can move between VirtualBox installs or whatever.
Right. So it looks like some of my deployments may have hung. I think I gave it a little bit too much to chew on whenever I told it to deploy MongoDB as well.
So another tip as well is after I did the Vagrant init, I opened the Vagrant file and gave it a lot more memory. I think it defaults.
I wish that I wasn't constrained with just the 2 gigs on the OS 10, but I wanted to make sure that I gave an accurate representation of running this system that's not Ubuntu. So.
Sure. So if you certainly have the RAM available, though, absolutely edit your Vagrant file and give it a ton of RAM, because you're making containers inside a virtual machine, and that gets hungry after a while.
Right. All right. So, with all of this stated, I implore the community to check this out, start poking at it, find any holes that we may possibly have. If you do find any issues with the Vagrant itself regarding the documentation, you can open issues at github.com/juju/docs, and we'll be more than happy to look at those. Community contributions for interesting ways that you're finding to use Vagrant. Make sure that you email the list, reach out to us on IRC, and if you have any projects that you want to get started, I'm going to start a community effort to actually get this out there, and I've heard a lot of good ideas for using Vagrant so that way you can kind of do portable containerized Juju deployments and share them with your friends if you're not on a Ubuntu native machine.
Right. So I do have some questions here about the tail end of your workflow, right? So it's it's the end of the day, and you're done working. Obviously I don't want to tear this all down, right? So can you go over the suspend commands and how you kind of, the difference between halt and suspend?
Okay. Vagrant halt is what I would use, because what Vagrant halt does is it's going to stop that machine. Now, if you want to suspend it, there is, I believe the Vagrant suspend is the command Vagrant help. Yeah, I think it's just halt. Halt actually stops the machine, and then whenever you kick it back up, it's going to go through a normal startup sequence, but it's not going to kick off the cloud init scripts to rebootstrap your environment and bring up the GUI again, because all that's already provided for you.
Right. So let's say I have my application in my database running in the VM right now, and I do Vagrant halt. The next day, I'm ready to start working again. I do Vagrant up. After that comes up, those services should still be running, right? Or
Correct.
does it shut down everything?
That does shut down. What that's going to do is it's going to shut down your LXC containers, and then whenever you restart the next day, whenever you bring Vagrant up, it would start those back up. So if you have work in progress that you need to make sure that nothing has changed, then yes, that's when Vagrant suspend would be invaluable. It's just like suspending your laptop, and then Vagrant resume would bring it back out of that sleep state and resume your running processes.
So if you're hacking, you're in an airport, your battery's starting to run low, the magic command there is Vagrant suspend.
Yes.
Then you're okay. Okay, got it.
Right.
I just wanted to make sure that we had covered that. And then every day, just Vagrant up, and then Vagrant suspend, or halt.
If you suspended, what you're going to want to do is Vagrant resume, because Vagrant up is going to assume that it needs to power the machine back on. And if I'm not positive on how it reacts to that, but I do believe that it complains that it's got a cache file, stating, "Hey, wait, are you sure you want to do this?"
Okay, got it.
That's just to make sure that you don't lose work. So.
Right. Right.
Another thing is that you also have a Vagrant package, which if you've done some work inside of a Juju Vagrant machine and you've got all this awesomeness going on and you want somebody to get started quickly and you don't want them to go through all the provisioning and retrace the steps that you've done, you can run Vagrant package and that will export a box for someone to re-import into their Vagrant environment and then kick it on and they've got everything that you've already done.
Right. So you could deploy Hadoop or something in there. Let's just do a crazy example with the entire workload, the data set, all that stuff.
You're a brave man, sir, with many gigabytes of RAM.
Yeah, and then just give that to somebody. Not ideal, but for small apps that could work, right? Here's my little web app.
Ideally, you're limited to what your desktop system has. Like if I were demoing this on my desktop with 24 gigs of RAM, I would have kicked this up to, I don't know, 8 gigs of RAM, and then just started hacking away and deploying left and right. And at that point, if I've got this nice little micro cloud that maybe resembles my cloud that I'm working on at work, then I'll just package that up and ship that to the rest of the developers so that they can get started quickly. At that point, they don't even need to go through the configuration management steps because they've got everything out of the box.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, this was very useful. I myself, I'm running Vagrant 1.5 that lets me use the Vagrant Cloud boxes that we have published. So other than that, we'll add this video to the docs. Thanks for showing us how to use this. I think even if you're using Linux, I think it's useful to be able to have a containerized, here's a quick demo, share with somebody. So thanks for that. And then we went ahead and posted the URL to to your work there for people who want to modify the boxes and things like that. I think Marco had some ideas where we can make the initial boot there, do nice things and stuff like that for people. So we'll go ahead and publish that and post to the list. Other than that, I'll give it about another 30 seconds for questions. I've been really waiting for this Charm School because I really wanted to move over to a Vagrant workflow. So I feel more comfortable when I'm talking to people who have Macs and Windows.
Another thing to point out is that Vagrant makes mistakes cheap because the fact that you can tear it down and get it spun back up so quickly,
Right.
You're not reinstalling your host OS if you get some kind of crazy idea that maybe you want to start hacking on Juju Core.
Right.
Maybe you're that kind of crazy and you want to start throwing out some Go code. It's a great isolated environment. So anything that you want to do with this that you can reproduce, or you want to test out a new theory, throw it in Vagrant. It makes failure cheap.
Awesome. Great. I will certainly do that. And then now, as far as having multiple boxes, what's your workflow? I'm just interested in. Do you have a separate directory for each project where you put a Vagrant file individually there, or do you?
No, my personal workflow is that I use one if I want to test a full deployment, but whenever it comes to testing individual charms, I'm placing them individually in the charm directory itself, and I use the same base box for that. Now, whenever I type Vagrant box list, you're going to see that I have multiple boxes installed on my machine. I have a Juju box, I have a Trusty box. The Juju box is a precise-based Juju image that has the GUI and everything else. The Trusty box is a base level Ubuntu server 64-bit image. Yep. And then I have the vanillas down there too for testing on just a base install of Ubuntu itself. Maybe the Trusty box is a little crazy, but the Trusty box is so that way I know that I'm running my tests against this individual unit. And I keep the Ubuntu machines updated concurrently using the Vagrant site because those have the pointers. So anytime that I run a Vagrant up, it's fetching it. It doesn't actually cache those images.
Okay. Yeah, that was my next question. Upgrades. After I've added these, and I have Precise 64 and Trusty 64, does Vagrant automatically check?
Now, once you've got that set to a URL and you already have it imported, unless you Vagrant box remove, it's just going to assume that everything's good to go. So you need Vagrant box remove.
Is there a box upgrade?
I think so. Vagrant box tac H.
Outdated or update.
It's update. Yeah. Vagrant box update Juju box. And if I could type. I didn't remove it. Vagrant.
I ran it on mine. I'll be checking for updates to Trusty 64. That's Juju. You're running the latest version, so that's pretty slick.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so the big idea behind that is that as long as you run update, it'll fetch it from the listed resource URL. And if you don't have that listed in your Vagrant file and there's no meta associated with your box, maybe it's pertinent to go investigate //.vagrant. And looking in here, you'll see that you've got machines, but I don't think this is right. I think it's .d, cd.vagrant. Yeah, .d is where it warehouses everything. This is where your boxes go. This is where Vagrant warehouses its metadata about the different providers that you're using. And this is fairly recent. I'm going to say that this was introduced in Vagrant 1.2 plus, somewhere around that neighborhood. So looking at this, if you cd into boxes, this is where it's going to warehouse all of your meta about it. And if I cd into TrustyBox, that's not right. What am I remembering that's not right? JujuBox.
Yeah. I've got like 23 gigs.
A little bit more time with this because there's a couple different locations in here where it stores the meta, and you can see where it's actually pointing at to go fetch the meta and where to fetch that image file. But it does cache information around it, and also if you pre-package init scripts with it, that's where those would be located as well.
Okay, great. So, awesome, new tool. So after this, we're doing Juju troubleshooting for our next Sharp schools. I've announced those dates on the list, and we'll don't have them off the top of my head, but that's going to be a 2-hour block because we got a lot to cover. So with that, thanks everyone for joining us, and happy Juju Vagranting, and we'll see everyone next time. Thanks.
Thanks everybody for your time.